You guys are welcome. Please come in. Keep filling the seats right here. Thank you for coming to my session here about Windows 10 and Azure AD in this last slot on the Microsoft Tech Summit in Chicago. My name is Jairo Cadena. I'm a program manager on the Azure AD team at Microsoft. And I own particularly scenarios that have to do with devices coming into Azure AD and all the benefits that you and your customers will get by bringing those devices into Azure AD. What we have called registration of devices, enrollment of devices, or in the past we called that workplace join. We have a concept for that today. Domain join, Azure AD join. So we're going to talk today on what are those benefits that you will get by bringing those devices into Azure AD, and in particular, we're going to talk about Windows 10 and how Microsoft's vision is to make Windows 10 the best platform for doing work and for being productive. By the way, my Twitter handle is right there, my blog, so please, let's keep the conversation going. I'm super interested in knowing how you or your customers are bringing those devices into Azure AD. We're going to talk about domain join. How many of you guys have Active Directory on-prem today? Like all of you, right? Almost all of you. With Active Directory, we have domain join devices, right? Who has domain join devices? Yep, the same hands, of course. So we're going to see how bringing those domain join devices that you today have, that you have invested a bunch of effort and money over the years, 15, 20 years now, and then how bringing those devices to Azure AD will bring some benefits to your users and to your admins. So let me start with this slide. Who attended the session that I delivered yesterday about Azure AD and EMS, Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite? Just a couple of hands. So basically I'm just showing this to show the reality of things. 63% of the data breaches come from passwords that are either weak, that are stolen, and in other words, 63% of those data breaches come from within. 80% of your users are using some kind of non-approved SaaS application. So you have a set of approved applications. Your users decide to just go the other way, find a tool, an application that works better for them, and they use it. And then the last one is how much organizations are trying to invest more in IT. So basically, it's a flat line. So you as an IT admin has a very interesting challenge, which is how to enable productivity without exposing yourself and your enterprise resources for threats and basically vulnerabilities out there. So we talked actually yesterday about how Azure AD, as more applications come into play, more devices, more locations, from a mobile workforce, Azure AD is that hub in the middle that will be able to give you the control and the tools to manage the access to those applications from those users that can work anywhere, from those devices that they bring into the organization to access data and resources. And basically is that, that glue that comes with your identities that you already have in on-prem AD, and then how those same identities can access the thousands of applications that we have integrated today with Azure AD, on-premises applications that you can publish through the Azure AD proxy, for example, applications that you lift and shift to Azure using Active Directory, Azure AD domain services, or simply any mobile application that you, custom LOB app that you develop in-house. So with a simple connection, Azure AD Connect will take those identities that are on-prem, will bring them to the cloud. You may decide to keep your passwords on-prem. You may decide to deploy some federation server like ADFS or any third party, or you may decide to sync up the hashes of those users up to the cloud. So Azure AD does the actual authentication. And then by doing that, there are a bunch of benefits that come, especially on single sign-on, on access, on the user side, but also on the admin side, control, auditing, compliance, all that. We will see some of them in this session. Now, yesterday I also talked about why Azure AD. Azure AD is an established directory today. There are 1.3 billion authentications per day that, of course, will not only give us the robustness to support those, but also the data and the intelligence that only that kind of data could bring. And then we can bring that back to you in terms of reporting and data and risk analysis and all that, that you can benefit from. And then, of course, we have other data. 85% of Fortune 500 customers have Azure AD. Azure AD is the directory for Office 365, Azure applications, CRM, all these applications. We have more than 10 million directories today, more than 750 million user accounts today. And then we have 33,000 customers who are mainly enterprises that have, gotten to Azure AD through the EMS suite, the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, not through Office 365 or any other application. And this is a service that has been there, about 2 years, and we're growing. So anyway, so we talked yesterday about the different pillars that Azure AD will bring to your organization. One, identity that will bring access to thousands of applications. The ability for you to collaborate with different organizations, partner organizations, without setting up complex federation infrastructure or anything like this. You can have your partner organization basically kind of like a part of a group membership, and then, boom, you would have just granted access to that user, to your SharePoint Online or to any of your resources. You will be able to manage access at scale. We have not only auditing reports that you will be able to put into big data tools like Power BI and things like this, but also we have some intelligence that is built in already, so you can identify risk. So you could see what are the users that have been flagged for risk, behavioral patterns that may not be, common practices that you may be able to implement in your organization in order to do preventive operations and basically keep your resources secure. And then, of course, we have all the security benefits on cloud power protection. We have conditional access, the ability for you to protect resources based on conditions. So you could say things like, I will only allow access to email only if there's a request that comes from a known device. So you could say that only my domain join devices will be able to have access to email, or only devices that meet some kind of compliance by Microsoft Intune, for example, things like this. And all that is because, the current reality is that, the world has changed quite a lot in the last 10, 15 years. So before you had this boundary, which was your corporate network, you had all your devices, all your applications on-prem, and then, you started opening, maybe deploying some servers in the DMZ, allowing VPN access from outside. But then, of course, that was not true anymore. You had more and more applications in the cloud, more and more devices coming. And then, of course, the challenge is how you have the peace of mind that by enabling this new reality, you are not exposing your enterprise resources or your organizational resources to bad actors. So let's talk about Windows 10 and why in general, bringing devices to Azure AD bring some of these benefits that I very briefly went through, but in particular, what is the additional benefits that Windows 10 will bring to the table? So anytime that we talk about benefits, especially with identity and security capabilities, we need to think about the two actors. One is the users who want to be productive, who don't want to be delayed when they are doing work. That's why they come and they bring their own devices, go to their own applications. But then, of course, how we can keep that environment secure, how you can, sleep at night without thinking that something is exposed. So let me start with a very simple, straightforward benefit that actually is the core foundation of all the value and productivity that even we introduced 20, 15 years ago when we introduced domain join to Active Directory. And that was single sign-on. So when you join a computer to an Active Directory on-prem, that computer will get a new identity. That computer will get a channel, a management channel with a central entity that is the domain, the Active Directory domain, the Active Directory forest. And by virtue of having that trust relationship with Active Directory, that device will enjoy some benefits and will be constrained to some controls. And of course, one of the big benefits was that you sign into your device, you type your credentials in Windows Logon UI, and then from that point on, if you needed to go to a printer or a file server or a SQL server or a specific web application, you didn't need to type your password again, right? So that's single sign-on. So we are bringing that concept, that very fundamental concept, back to Azure AD as well. And what we are saying is that when you sign into Windows 10 with your corporate account, it could be a domain join device, it could be an Azure AD join device, and we'll talk about a little bit more about those differences in a bit. But you will have true single sign-on, and that is the promise, and that's something that we want to achieve not only at the platform level in Windows, but also with applications like Office and other, the full ecosystem of applications as well. But the idea is that you sign into your device, you get single sign-on to Office 365, you get single sign-on to your file servers or print servers on premises, or you get single sign-on to your on-premises applications that are published through the Azure AD application proxy, or Office 365 SaaS applications. All applications that trust in Azure AD or AD, you will be able to have that experience of seamless access. But of course, there is a parallel to that. When you offer single sign-on, there is a security implication on that. Imagine that you sign into your device, that device gets stolen, and of course that bad actor now won't need to know your password or your credentials, because now you're enjoying single sign-on, and then now that bad actor can go and access applications that they don't have access to. So with the fact that that device now is known to Azure AD, now we can create conditional access policies that can prevent these kinds of situations. Now, conditional access policies are basically logic that you can create in place to protect a specific application that could be based on specific conditions, like the device from where the user is accessing this application from, the location where the user is accessing it from on-prem or from a Starbucks coffee or whatever, cafe, or conditions that are not deterministic but are from the environment, behavioral conditions, like is this request a low risk or a medium risk or a high risk request. And then what we do with those kinds of concepts is that we calculate that risk, behind the scenes, and based on behavioral patterns, then we assign a risk to that request, and we can say that, for example, you can create a rule that says that for medium risk access, I will require multi-factor authentication. For low risk access or no risk, I will just grant access. And for high risk, I will deny access. So one example that I talked about yesterday was that when I was preparing my demo for yesterday's session, I was in the hotel room, I was doing my access, and one of the first things that I got was an access denied, and it was because Azure AD detected that I was signing into the application from a non-familiar location. So Azure AD is receiving all these, authentications from your users, the part of those 1.3 billion authentications per day, and we know what are the common patterns for that specific user, and if we detect that, that now this user is accessing this application from 2 different locations or from a location that probably is not too close or anything, patterns, types of, hours of the day or things like that, then we'll basically flag that, and you have control to say what do you want to respond to in those cases. But then again, that's possible, like in the case of devices. You need to have a device that is known to Azure AD, so Azure AD can have that piece of data included in the computation of that risk, for example. Now, one of the things that we added in Windows 10 was this enterprise roaming of settings, which is basically the ability for you as a user to bring themes and settings from one device to another. So you may have your desktop at work, maybe you have a laptop, maybe you have a tablet, there is Azure AD join, some domain join, and then one of the things that we added in Windows 10 was that if you change your theme, you had some maybe enterprise data that was specific for a specific application. Now, by you signing in with your corporate account to multiple devices, that will go with you. And we had that in Windows 8.1 with your Hotmail account. Probably you realized that. But now we have that with your corporate account as well. And then, of course, the benefit to the admin is that you will have peace of mind that enterprise data, enterprise settings are not going to be in a consumer cloud. By the way that we roam those settings and those data is via a separate enterprise compliant cloud that meets specific compliance requirements, and we are not basically having consumer data and enterprise data along, or we're not leaking enterprise data to a consumer cloud, for example. Now, if you remember that very first statistic that I talked about, the 63% of data breaches that are coming from passwords, weak passwords, stolen passwords. One of the benefits that we introduced in Windows 10 was Windows Hello for Business. And that capability is basically the future for you to be able to get rid of passwords, whenever you're ready. Well, that's a process that you need to, if you're very interested in security, you're security conscious, and remove those data breaches and those threats. Maybe this is one of the ways to go, along with MFA, for example. But Windows Hello is basically a credential. It's a key that's generated in the TPM of the device. And then the public key is registered along with the device in Azure AD. And that key is the one that is going to be used for authentication. The credential doesn't leave the device. It's not exportable. It stays hardware protected. And basically by just showing proof of possession of that private portion of the key, you will be able to authenticate. So all the basically threats and issues that come with passwords will be reduced greatly. So we have some customers that are very security conscious, and you guys have heard in the past few years all the things in the news about so many passwords compromised in the government. Yahoo was recently, and there are some other big customers that have had that problem in the last 5 years. And so that's a very good capability to look into if you're interested in that. And then last but not least is the access to the Windows Store for Business, a way for you to offer specific enterprise applications and the ability for a user to use the work account to acquire those applications. All licensing and all this process will be based on the work account. So let me jump into a demo. Before that, any questions so far? We have talked about very, very high level of these benefits on Windows 10 and Azure AD. So anyway, so let me jump very quick into this demo. So what I have here is basically a brand new installation of Windows 10. And what I'm going to show you is what Azure AD Join is, you know? So I think everybody knows what domain join is. And domain join is this, again, the way that a device gets a trust with Active Directory on premises, and then all this gets light up. Azure AD Join is the ability for that device to get a trust directly with Azure AD. There is no trust with on-prem AD, and it's a great solution for mobile workers, maybe a portion of your maybe a Salesforce people, or even enterprise people that are okay by having that level of management of the device and some of the restrictions that today still Azure AD Join has, but I'll talk about more about that. Now, for Azure AD Join, there are two ways that you can set up a device. One is through the out-of-box experience, and this is the case in which I just step into a Best Buy, buy a brand new Windows 10 Professional or Enterprise SKU, and then I turn it on, and one of the first things that it asks me is this your corporate, is this a company-owned device? Is this your personal device? If I say it's my company device, then I will be able to enter my corporate credentials, my Azure AD credentials, and then magic will happen after that. Now, the second one is when I am already in, maybe I set up the device with my Hotmail account or a local account, and I'll go to settings, and I'm going to switch, basically change the ownership, let's say, of that device to a corporate device. So I'm going to show the second one. If you are interested in seeing the first one, you can go to my blog. There's all the screenshots or the version of this session at Microsoft Ignite 2015, which I delivered that. I showed the out-of-box experience. In this particular one, I want to highlight some few things through settings, so that's why I chose it here. So if you go to settings, there is this accounts, and then here you will see your information. So in this particular case, this is a local account. I'm an administrator on the device, and here you will see this option, access, work, or school. So what you will see is basically this page that says, now you can connect to work or school. Of course, you do that because you want to gain access to applications that otherwise would not be possible if you didn't do that. And the way that you as an admin make that constraint is by creating these conditional access policies. So imagine that I want to access my email from this device, but there's a conditional access policy, and I'll show that in my second demo later in the session, that says that only domain join devices or only compliant devices can access email. So my only option is go and do this. So when I do connect, what I will see is basically a signing page, and this is a page that's hosted in Azure AD. And basically, it tells me a few things. One is that you can set up this device by authenticating with your corporate account, and there are two actions here. It says join this device to Azure Active Directory. join this device to a local Active Directory domain. So this is very important, and actually this is an area that I would like to get feedback from people, and I'm basically getting that feedback now. There are 3 ways that you can set up a device for work. One is the traditional domain join device. So you domain join the device. With Windows 10, now those devices will automatically register with Azure AD. So now that domain join device will have a trust with on-prem AD and will have a trust with Azure AD. When we do Windows logon, we obtain tokens, single sign-on tokens, to both domain controllers, AD on-prem, and to Azure AD. And I'll walk through all the logic in a few slides. That's one, domain join. Traditionally, domain join, Windows 10 will bring new benefits by registering them with Azure AD. The second one is Azure AD join. This trust doesn't exist anymore. Now it's only a trust to Azure AD. And still you would use your corporate account to sign in to Windows as you do in a domain join device, right? You use your NetBIOS format or your UPN to sign into to Windows itself, and as part of that, you get signing to the Active Directory or to Azure AD. In Azure AD Join, you use your UPN in Azure AD, and then you'll get access and single sign-on and all that to both Azure AD and on-prem AD. So those are what we call the corporate-owned devices methods of configuring a device. But there's a third one, which is I sign in with my Hotmail account, with my Live account, with my Xbox account, whatever, my Microsoft account. It's my device. It's not my organization's device. I have my personal photos and whatever I have in my device. But I want to still be productive from my device. And that's what we call the at work or school account. When you do that, you don't sign into your device with your corporate account. You keep signing in with your Hotmail account, and that, what we call the primary account, will drive most of the experiences in Windows, like Cortana and things like the basic notifications and things like that. But you would still be able to have like a secondary account, is your work account, and you will still have access to Azure AD. What we do in Azure AD, all of these 3 methods, domain join, Azure AD join, and at work account, which is basically the evolution of what we called workplace join in the past. So again, domain join, Azure AD join, and workplace join. All of them have device objects in the cloud. So basically, we have representation of those devices in Azure AD. They are marked as domain join, if domain join, as Azure AD join, if Azure AD join, as workplace join, if at work, a school account. And we will be able to exercise policy based on those attributes. So you could create a policy that says only domain join devices will have access to email, but not any other type of device. Because maybe you have invested over the years in management tools for those domain join devices. You have closed down those devices very well, so you trust those devices, and those are the only ones that you trust. So in this particular case, in this window that you see here, again, I am logged on with a local account. It's like my device. By default, if I follow this flow and I authenticate in this window, I will do the at work or school account. So this is, again, the personal device case. I sign in with my Hotmail or my local account, in my home PC, and I want to be productive. I click Connect on the button in the previous page, and then I see a signing page. If I continue there, again, that's the personal device case, at work or school account, I will keep signing into that device with my Hotmail account. So for this case of the demo, we don't want to do that. We want to join this computer to Azure AD. I want to be able to sign in with my work account to this device, and by virtue of that, have single sign-on to Office 365 and all those benefits that I have just talked about. So I need to click here, join this device to Azure AD, and then when I type my UPN, what I will do is I'm just going to join this device to my Microsoft organization, and then what's happening is that now it's doing home realm discovery. It notices that ntdev.microsoft.com is a UPN that belongs to a federated tenant, and then it redirects that signing window to the ADFS. In this particular case, is the Microsoft ADFS. So this is basically a page that is hosted on-prem. It's not in Azure AD. I enter the UPN to Azure AD. Azure AD noticed that this is a federated tenant. It redirected me to that signing page. So here, I enter my credentials. In this case, it's just my username and password. And one of the things that are happening here is that for security reasons, we require additional information to verify your account. I say, let's say, sign in with your phone. So what's happening is that as any other application in Azure AD, Azure DRS, Azure Device Registration Service, which is kind of like the application that is responsible for registering devices to Azure AD, require MFA. And that's kind of like a conditional access policy. I'm trying to access an application, which is Azure DRS, but Azure DRS requires MFA. So in this particular case, I receive a notification in my phone that tells me, do you want to approve this, this request? So what I will do is I will just approve it. So using my Authenticator application, I'll find it very quick. I lost the notification while I was talking. So I do go to the Authenticator app, and then it says approve sign in. I enter my PIN. I say approve. Okay, request expired. All right. So let me retry that again. I talk too much in between. So let's see. So I type again my UPN. Hang on, I didn't do, okay, let's try again. So connect. And then here, remember, I need to do this, join this device to Azure Active Directory. I type my UPN. It redirects me to the ADFS page of my organization. I type my username, or rather my password. It tells me now that additional information is required. I choose to sign in with my phone, and then I will receive now a notification on my phone. It says, we've sent a notification to your mobile device. Please respond to continue. I'm currently at the Authenticator app, and then I will get that notification at any time now. I receive it. Now I say, do you want to approve it? I say approve. I enter my PIN, and then it says approved in my Authenticator app, and this should just approve the session that is currently happening at this point. Now it continues, and what's happening behind the scenes is that by entering my username, my password, and my MFA proof, what's happening is that a token is obtained to Azure DRS, again, the service that registers devices with Azure AD. Here it tells me, make sure that this is your organization. They said, yeah, this is my organization. I do join. And then what's happening is that now the device has a token to Azure DRS. The device, generates a pair of keys and basically sends a certificate signing request to Azure DRS. With that token, Azure DRS checks that the token is valid, and then will sign the certificate, will send it back. Now the device will have an identity, a new identity. It will have a certificate placed in the machine store, and then a device object would have been created in the cloud at this point. So it says, you are all set. The device is connected to Microsoft. So now I do done. And let me show you very quick where I close. But then if I go to accounts, then here, if I go to Access Workers School, it will tell me that now it's connected to Microsoft's Azure AD. So remember that I'm still signing with my local account. So what I will do is I will do I will do a log off, and then I will be able now to sign in with my UPN. So let me do this. We have on a VM, I think we will need, let me restart that very quick. So anyway, so then what happens is that now that the device is primed with that trust to Azure AD, and we have added new components in Windows, in WinLogon, that very similar to what, the Kerberos SSP was. For Kerberos experts in the room, we created a new component that is also an authentication provider in Windows Logon that takes those credentials and send them to Azure AD. And when those credentials are sent to Azure AD authenticates the user, authenticates the device as well with that certificate that was placed previously, and then it will issue back a single sign-on token that we call a primary refresh token. So you will hear about this over and over. And let me type my credentials very quick. So I type my username and my password. So what's happening now is that the Logon UI component got my credentials. It is sending them to the CredProp, the credential provider, the username and password provider, will send them to this new component that we call the Cloud Authentication Provider. It takes those credentials, send them to Azure AD. Azure AD take the credentials of the user, the device identity, and then it authenticates the user, sends back that token, and then that token will be basically the token that will allow the device to obtain new tokens, new access tokens to applications that trust in Azure AD. So basically that primary refresh token is what in the Kerberos world is. Who knows that? Yeah, it's a ticket. It's really a ticket granting ticket. It's a TGT. And that TGT, when you want to go to a service principal, you say, I want to request a service ticket for, let's say, this file server, and here's my TGT, sent to a domain controller. The domain controller will authenticate that TGT on behalf of the user, will return the service ticket, and with that service ticket, you get access to the file server. The flow is identical. Now you have this primary refresh token that is obtained by Azure AD. Now you want to go to, let's say, SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online says, I need an access token. I have a PRT. I send it to Azure AD. Azure AD authenticates that PRT on behalf of that user and then returns an access token. Now with that access token, that user and that device will be able to access Office 365. So here I am logged on. And so let's go and take a look here to accounts, access workers, cool. And notice that now I have this icon. So one of the other things that happen behind the scenes is that, we talked about the trust that will give single sign-on, but also in the domain join world, we have this concept of this management channel. Who knows what's the name of that channel? Group policy, right? So basically, along with that, there's a secure channel that the Windows domain join device will have with a domain controller, and then a DC can push policy, can enforce specific constraints into that device. Via group policy, you can deploy scripts, you can deploy applications, you can set register keys, et cetera, et cetera. You may have additional tools on top of that, like SCCM, for example, or a third party. But in the Azure AD join world, there's no group policy. Because again, the trust is with Azure AD. But one thing that happens is that, that along with the registration with Azure AD, the device got enrolled into Microsoft Intune as well. In the Windows 10 case, there are additional third-party MDMs that you can integrate with Azure AD. We're talking about, AirWatch or Mobile Iron, Citrix. We have a list of them. You can see them from the Azure AD portal. the Azure portal. But the key point is that that device doesn't only have the identity pieces, but also the management pieces. So now you can manage that device, let's say with Microsoft Intune, and then you can push MSIs or can control specific things into that device. So okay, so let me jump back to the presentation. So actually, we went over a lot of concepts, but let me try to go step by step for those of you who want to know exactly what happens behind the scenes. So here we have Azure AD, correct? Say contoso.com. We have a user that's part of that directory. And then we have a brand new device that, in the particular case of the demo, the user went over, joined Azure AD, and all that happened. So let's say that we are at the moment in which that trust has been created. Again, there's a certificate that is placed in the device, and there is a key. That key, STK, that probably you will hear over and over, is the storage key. It's basically a key that is derived from the storage root key of the TPM. The hardware key that is placed in every TPM is derived from that, and that key is the one that will bind single sign-on tokens, like the PRT, precisely the PRT, to that device. Which means that if I am a bad actor and I take that PRT and I take it from this device, from a user session that is already signed in, and I want to steal it and put it in my device, that PRT will be useless. Because there will be session keys that are derived from, that are basically used to sign the PRT, that are derived from this SDK. And that SDK, the public portion of that SDK, is registered along in Azure AD on that device object. And we will use that over authentication every time. So now, remember, the device was joined, and then the user signed out, or maybe rebooted the device, and then now that user is going to sign into that device again. So we talked about that user entering credentials in the logon UI. The credential provider will get those credentials. They pass them to a new authentication provider called the Cloud AP, which sends them the user creds along with the certificate of the device and the SDK to Azure AD. Azure AD looks up the user account, looks up the device object, checks that the SDK, public portion corresponds to this, to the signature of the challenge that is sent, and looks the device. And when they say, and actually at this point we have user identity, we have device identity, but along with that we have many other things like location. So for example, we will know the IP address from which this request is happening, and we have behavioral patterns for that user, et cetera, et cetera. But then along with this, we basically return that PRT, the primary refresh token, again, like a TGT like in the Kerberos world. And primary refresh token is basically a refresh token that doesn't have a specific audience in place, but it would allow for any access token to any audience as long as it is made from this device. And again, from this device means that that device has possession of that private portion of that SDK key. So when the PRT is returned, that token is cached in the LSA of the device, in the secure zone of the device, in the local security authority of it. And only the Cloud AP and one new component that is called the Web Account Manager, which is part of the new authentication architecture in Windows, which is the one that is going to provide that single sign-on to applications that use that specific API. And we have an ADAL version that integrates on top of the APIs of the Web Account Manager that, for example, Office 2016 implements. There are some other applications like Office Universal that goes directly to the Web Account Manager and uses that API. But the key point is that that PRT is cached, and then when the user is already in the desktop, and let's say he or she is trying to go to Office 365 or Azure AD published applications through the proxy, SaaS applications, what happens is that there will be some client applications. Maybe the user opens the browser, or maybe the user opens Word or Outlook, and that client application is going to request a token to the Web Account Manager. So basically we'll say, I need to go to SharePoint Online. Let's say Word is opening a file that is placed in SharePoint Online, or Outlook is trying to get the mailbox from Exchange Online. Then that client application is going to request a token to the Web Account Manager. It says, hey, give me a token to SharePoint Online. But what happens is that now the Web Account Manager says, okay, do I have a token for this user? No, I don't, but I have a PRT. So then I will send the PRT to Azure AD, and I will request an access token for SharePoint Online. Basically, the PRT contains identity information for the user, identity information from the device, and again, along with that request in which we send that PRT, there's information about the IP address of the device, location, and behavioral patterns of that user that are implicit as part of that request. Then what Azure AD will do is check the conditional access policy of that application that the user is trying to authenticate. So in this particular case, let's say SharePoint Online. So it will look into the SharePoint application, SharePoint Online application, and will check whether there's a policy in place, a policy that you as an admin would have placed before. And if all this input, the user identity, the device identity, the location, and all that meet that policy, then that token is returned back. So with that token, now the client application or the browser will just send it to the service application, and then the user will have access. So this is basically what happens behind the scenes, step by step, on the Azure AD side. Along with this, we do exactly the same because we have the user credentials, and we do a parallel process against a domain controller, which, by the way, the left-hand side of that is what a domain join device does today. It takes the credentials, sends them to the Kerberos authentication provider, sends it to the DC. The DC returns the TGT. Then the user, the Win32 application, for example, will exchange the TGT for a service ticket. It's exactly the same flow. But then we're having this parallel between the cloud and on-prem, and both domain join devices and Azure AD join devices, if they have a line of sight to a domain controller, all this will happen behind the scenes. And the PRT will be used for single sign-on to cloud applications, and the TGT will be used for single sign-on to on-premises applications. So we talked very briefly about the different types of devices. Domain joined, Azure AD joined, which are considered work-owned devices. Again, you sign into those devices with your work account, and the main Windows experiences, Cortana, Windows Store, et cetera, will be driven by that primary account. And the case of workplace joint devices is the case in which you sign in with your Hotmail account, your live account, consumer personal account, but then you add your work account on top of that, and you will still have access. You will have an identity with Azure AD, but what you can do will be limited to whatever policy the admin has set when accessing resources. So The other box that, the blue box that's behind that is kind of, what, in the interest of categorizing these devices, Azure AD Join is this notion of a mobile device. So it's a lightweight way to manage a device. It's using Microsoft Intune or a third-party MDM. It doesn't have the full spectrum of what group policy has. We have thousands and thousands of policies that you can control in a device at a very fine-grained detail that's not possible with Intune or third-party MDM, but that may be okay. In the modern world where you have a mobile workforce in which you can offer this kind of self-service setup, like, somebody lost or damaged their device while on a trip, that person can go get a new device and set that device by themselves without any help desk or IT involvement. So those are benefits that you could get from Azure AD Join devices that are considered mobile devices. And of course, workplace join devices are, my phones, my tablets that are not desktop devices like domain join devices. But again, you could, with the benefits that we've talked about, even domain join devices can have that single sign-on experience to the cloud. So now with the form factors that we have today, you could have tablets that are domain joined and yet will have those benefits as well. So when you are thinking on deploying devices for your organization, not so much on the identity part, but on the management part is probably where you are going to make your decision. Is my device really needed to be managed at that fine-grained approach? Can I just have a more lightweight type of management, in which case Azure AD Join could be great. So anyway, so again, we are still learning from use cases, from you guys, from customers, how you perceive this value. So it is very clear, since we launched Windows 10, 2 years ago approximately. Many people have domain join devices. We have probably millions or tens of millions of domain join devices today in the world. By doing very specific and very easy operations like with Azure AD Connect, I will go through this. You will get those devices right away registered with Azure AD, and you will get all these benefits. So the value is very clear. Many people have domain join devices. They do one or two things. They get all these benefits. With Azure AD Join, we have cases that are very specific. So, for example, we have Delta, SkyWest, in which they have very particular use cases, like pilots requiring to get, their manuals in their cockpits by instead of, taking the realm of heavy manuals, they put that on Azure AD Join devices. The pilot that is flying that plane at that moment will just sign into the device, and we'll be able to have that. And we've seen specific use cases like that as well, and in retail sector and things like this. We're still learning what does it mean to the enterprise, comparing especially domain join devices, which is something that you guys have already deployed and invested for a long time, versus moving to Azure AD Join. So again, it's a learning process that probably we will keep working with you on this. So let me jump to a second demo in which I'll show you how an admin can protect resources based on device policies. So I'm here at the Azure portal, the new Azure portal, which, by the way, has been many of the functionality that we had in the Azure management portal. We have ported out to the Azure portal now. We're technically in public preview, but we're going to GA very soon. but you will be able to do most of the things that you might want to do from this portal. So I'm here on my directory, and when you go to the directory, like on the left pane, you'll see all the different solutions, and one of them is here, Azure Active Directory. When you click on that, you will see this, which is basically a dashboard, and then on the left side, you will see a bunch of actions. So, like you could manage your users and groups, your applications, et cetera, but then one of them is conditional access. And this is where you want to go when you want to protect specific resources. So conditional access is actually the ability for you to given certain conditions, you would require or you would do some action. So given some conditions, you may decide to block access, or you may decide to just allow access, or you may decide to require MFA, you need something else. So a very typical case that I've heard that people are deploying is the ability to require a domain join device, a well-known device, but in case you don't have one, then I want to ask for MFA. At least I will have some level of assurance that although the device is not known, I want to have more proof that the user is that user, So let's say in this particular case, there are no policies. I'm going to create a new one. And when I do that, I will see this. So one is the name of the policy. So let's say that I want to protect Office 365 to only known devices or compliant devices. And what you will see here is what are the conditions that will trigger this policy. And so I will be able to, so I see users and groups, I see cloud applications and conditions. And then I see controls, zero control selected. So let's see. So on users and groups, I will be able to define the scope of this policy. So I can say that this policy will apply to all users. So all users that are going to access a specific application that I will be able to define next will be evaluated for this conditional access policy. I can specify just some users or some groups. I can specify an exclusion group, an exemption group, which typically is used when you are rolling this functionality out, and maybe there are users that maybe don't have the right configuration in their devices, and maybe you are blocking all users who don't have domain join devices or compliant devices, but they are not quite there yet. You could exclude them. So you say, let's say all users, and then now, okay, so done here, and then I'm going to choose what applications will apply this policy to. So I could say that all applications, all cloud applications, or I can say selected applications. In this particular case, let's say that I am interested in protecting Office 365 applications, so I could say Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Yammer. I do select. And all right, I could say I could exclude an application again if maybe I'm hearing that as part of my proof of my pilot rollout or something like that, I hear many complaints that people don't have access to email, so maybe I could exclude Exchange Online for a temporary basis. So I do done here, and then I go to the conditions section that will allow me to specify more of these inputs that I talked about previously. So one is device platforms, and I can say that this policy applies to all platforms, meaning that users accessing from, regardless of the platform, Windows, iOS, Android, and even platforms that we do not support today. For example, Mac OS X is coming soon, but all platforms will be subject to this policy. So it says configure, yes, I want to do that. I could say all platforms, or I could say just select some platforms. So again, like if I'm doing some rollout, I want to do some testing on Windows alone, I could just do this, for example, or if it's iOS and Android, or I can just say all platforms. So if I do down here, I could also choose locations. So I can say configure yes, and now this particular policy that I'm creating would apply for any access from anywhere, or I would require that that something like, for example, I want this policy to be true only if access is made from a trusted location. And a trusted location is basically defined as an IP subnet, and I could say, I could create my different subnets, and that will be the trusted location. So when a device is coming to Azure AD with an IP address, if it is part of that subnet, then the policy will apply and will be evaluated. Or I can say, all locations. So in this particular case, I'm not interested in constraining the policy for a specific location. I say from everywhere. And then, so the question is, are these public IP addresses or private IP addresses? It would be public address in the sense, is in the end, the IP address that Azure AD will see. And it's at that point. Thanks for the question, very good, yeah. So, so I would say done, and then there's also an additional condition that I can specify here, which is client applications. And I can say that this policy applies to all applications, regardless of the type, or I could say that it's just a specific application. So for example, I can say that this would only apply to browser apps or to mobile apps and desktop clients. So we've heard from some customers that they are okay by allowing some level of or let's say constraining more when people are accessing from a rich application than from a browser. Because on a rich application you can download data and download settings that in a browser you may not. I mean, of course, browser applications today are very rich in many ways, but still you have that option. You could say, I will be a little bit more loose with my policy if I am having a request from a browser, like Outlook Web Access. Probably I just will require MFA, but if it is coming from an Outlook rich application, Office 2016 or whatever, then I will require that there's a known device attached to that policy. So anyway, so. Oh, this, yeah. Right, so actually that's a great question. So you see here, the question is about this label here that says legacy auth is currently not supported, which means that only modern authentication is part of this policy evaluation. What practically that means is that, let's say you have an Office 2013 that is not enabled for modern authentication. You can enable that via a registry key that maybe you can push via group policy or something like that. But that the protocol that Office 2013 uses is an old, let's say, a legacy protocol like org ID, which is mainly based on WS Trust to ADFS and then sending that to a different endpoint in Azure AD. Today, given that we haven't finished the migration between that system, org ID, and the new system of Azure AD, which basically is OpenID, OAuth based, then authentication requests coming to the system will be able to bypass any policy, any conditional access policy that is only evaluated in the new Azure AD. But then we are working on doing that. We expect, like in the few months, that next few months that will be completed, in which case that warning will just go away. Great question, yeah. Well, well, actually, good question. So the question is, from that point, will legacy apps be supported? Actually, what would be is that you will be able to truly block legacy without the need of ADFS, correct? Because today, you're right. Actually, you're doing great questions about the subject. Today, you can use ADFS rules to, let's say, block your WS Trust endpoint or block a specific, user agents like, the old Skype agent or things like this. You could create those rules in ADFS and then effectively block those legacy protocols, and then let the allow protocols be made by Azure AD. So anyway, so when you do that, configure now, okay, done. Then we have what we call controls, and here is that when the conditions above are met, then we can decide to block access or allow access. And if it's allow access, like for example in this case, for any user in the organization that comes to Office 365 that, what did we do here? That come from any platform, all locations, we would allow. So of course that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like all users, all Office 365, all locations, I will allow. Maybe that's not very secure. So we could say that if that happens, I will require a domain join device, or I will require a compliant device. So in this particular case, I have chosen 2. For multiple controls, require all the selected controls or one of the selected controls. So I would do this. So what we are saying here is that only a set of devices can be domain joined, right? Which are the truly domain joined to on-prem devices. Remember that we have 3 types of devices: domain join, Azure AD join, workplace join. The condition of allow or require domain join device, only domain join devices will be able to meet that policy. Azure AD join won't, and workplace join won't. But if we say that require compliant device, which by the way we are changing that label to reflect what the true meaning, which is require a device that is marked as compliant by the management system. So again, domain join devices are managed by SCCM or group policy. Azure AD join and workplace join devices, which are the ones that were mobile devices. Remember in the blue box behind those 2, they are managed by MDM, let's say Intune. So Intune is going to be able to check state on that device, and you as an admin can go to the Intune console and define what compliant means. So you could say that encryption must be enabled, that the PIN that protects the device needs to have certain complexity, that it is not jailbroken, whatever you define as compliant, and then whatever Intune does in the device will send it back to the service, and the service, if it meets that policy, will write back into Azure AD behind the scenes into that device object that is identified by the certificate that we provisioned previously. It will say, yep, it is compliant. If for any reason you disabled, let's say, encryption, and then at that point Intune will communicate that to the service will mark the device as not compliant, and then that device, which of course is not a domain join device, but it's whether it's a compliant or not. So again, a device object has actually 2 fields, 2 attributes that we are looking at. One is compliant. That attribute is written by the management system based on whatever compliance policy is set, and whatever it checks on the device, it marks is compliant or is not compliant. And there's a separate attribute that defines that device as a domain joined device, as an Azure AD joined device, or a workplace joined device. So when we say require domain joined device, it will check that second attribute, and only those who say domain joined device will be able to pass the gate. If it doesn't say that, and we have the other check, which is compliant, okay, you better have that is compliant bit marked as true if you want to go in. So this policy require compliant device or require domain joined device, require one of the selected controls. As long as one of those two policies are met, then the user will be able to have access to email and to SharePoint, for example. Right. The question is there a way to say domain join but not Azure AD join, or an Azure AD join but not workplace join? The answer is no. And the reason is because we call that second attribute device trust type. One is compliant and device trust type. Domain join in particular has a special notion to organizations because, again, you have invested in years in managing those devices, deploying those devices, closing down those devices. So the fact that it is already managed and have a trust to AD on-prem will bring you peace of mind that a brand new device from Best Buy, just for the fact that it's Azure AD joined, may not. So at that point, you really truly need a management system that is really checking that for you. So that's why we didn't put Azure AD join as a condition in particular. You will need to have an MDM, correct? Right. Correct, precisely. You will need to check that compliance to allow that, yeah. Perfect. So let me go very quick to the presentation. I have only 2 minutes, but I want to point you to some of, deployment considerations. We talked about this. There's really these two types, domain join and mobile devices. Domain join devices automatically register with Azure AD. Azure AD Connect is super important, is a key component of this auto registration. And actually you can register your Windows 7 or 8.1 or even server computers. And again, servers that are used as a desktop, like a developer who has a server computer but needs to access email from that as well, from there as well. So there's a Windows installer package for that. And then for mobile devices, it's an end-user initiated experience like Azure AD Join. I go do Azure AD Join, or I do add work or school account. The device enrolls into the MDM, and there's an alternative for personal devices. It's my device. I don't want it to be managed by the organization, which is the mobile application management with Intune, which is MAM without enrollment. And what it is it is just to the application scope. You don't have your device managed by the organization. So there are some requirements. There's specifically for domain join auto registration, there's a service connection point object that is required that Azure AD Connect creates in some instances, in some cases. If it is federated, you need some issuance transform rules. And there's a group policy for rollout. There is a detailed step-by-step in my blog on what happens on registration, auto registration of Azure AD. That points to a Microsoft Azure Docs document that gives you exactly what do you need to do. I won't go, we don't have time to do this today anyway, but go there and you'll see, you will be able to do whatever you have today with your domain join devices. You can register them right now and get benefits right now. So to complete very quick, let me go to a final demo, 30 seconds of demo, very quick, that basically shows the state of a domain join device. So there's a tool called dsreg cmd.exe. If I do status, /status, what it gives me is the following. So there's a device state that is basically all that doesn't relate to a specific user. This Azure AD join yes means that my device, this device, has a trust with Azure AD. Domain joined yes means that it is joined to an on-prem domain. In this case is the Redmond domain. And shows me some additional stuff like the device ID. For example, this is the one that you would use if you're using PowerShell commandlets to find the device in Azure AD. This is the thumbprint of the certificate that is used when Azure AD is actually authenticating the device. This is the handle that it is using to find it in the directory. Let's see what else. There are some URLs that, let's see, an important one is this one. Settings URL is basically the URL that is used to go and do enterprise roaming of settings. So if you have a theme in one device, you sign into a different device, you will see that same theme. And then you have your user state that shows the Azure AD PRT, which means it's telling me yes, it's telling me that when I logged on to this device, I successfully obtained a PRT from Azure AD. And actually this one, which is NGC was the code name for Windows Hello for Business. This is telling me NGC's next generation credentials, but probably we should change that name on this tool. But it tells me that yep, it is provisioned with that, which is basically, if I do log my device, it is looking for me, and it basically identifies me. So what I'm using right here is my 3D camera to identify my face, which I have previously provisioned when I sign in for the first time on this device. I'm not using any password to sign into my device, but when I provisioned it, it associated my bio gesture, which could be a fingerprint or it could be a simple PIN as well, with a key that is also generated in the TPM, and the public key is used for signing in. So if I want to sign in, I can just look at the camera and looking for you, making sure, hello, welcome, okay. And then what happened right there was that without typing the password, the credential, the Windows Hello for Business CredProv received a challenge from Azure AD. It signed it with the private key of that Windows Hello key, sent back the challenge. Azure AD checked with the public key that it has in my user account in Azure AD, confirmed that I had possession of that key, and returned the PRT. So that's basically what happened. So anyway, so we are out of time. I think I covered mostly what I wanted. That's great. Please just, I'll be here probably a few minutes, but thank you for coming. Find my Twitter handle, ask me any questions. Let's continue the conversation, and thank you.